Hello, my name is Jonathan Barton. I'm currently a professor in the Catholic University here in Santiago de Chile. And before that, I was a member of staff in UEA, where I worked for about 7 years prior to coming here in 2004. And today, in terms of the course that we're seeing with Jessica, is to talk about a different element of urban development in Santiago that is something that I think is fundamental for development studies students of human geography, is to look at the issues of inequality, not just look at issues of poverty. So I think in Latin America we have probably the worst situation in terms of distribution of income in the world. And also at the same time we have the largest concentration of urban population in the world, certainly in the global south. So here we have a concentration of issues of inequality in urban areas. And those are some of the issues I want to talk about today in terms of how we actually look at different features. One of those is consumption. Another is in terms of housing and, if you like, modernization and post-modernity in terms of urban development. But particularly the focus here is on inequality. But looking within a space within the urban area of Santiago in which we have high levels of high income and how these contrast with the much larger areas of lower income with different problems in terms of access to health, access to education, access to housing and access to different services. So this is the first point that I'd like to draw your attention to, is to say where we are. Santiago is a huge city, over 7 million people, but within Santiago, the urban area, called the metropolitan area, of 34 municipalities, there are about 3 which dominate in terms of having a high income population. And one of those is Las Condes, which is where we are today, which has about between 450, 500,000 people. So very, very large. Think of Norwich with 150, 170,000 people. So a substantial chunk of the city and a substantial population here concentrated of middle to higher income. And the question is, well, what's the difference in terms of when we look at this particular space compared to the other spaces you may see in the course? And what I want to point to is how similar it is to what we might find in Southern Europe, and in terms of styles of architecture and urbanism, which we'd say are very much representative of perhaps of Europe, and with also features of the United States types of urban development, urban design. So the first point is here in Apumanque. Apumanque was really one of the first malls in Chile. It reflected the gravitation from the center of the city, people moving to the east. As the center of the city became less popular to live, there was more housing space to the east. So there's been a whole gradual movement of the central business district towards the east of the city. So up here we have the mountains, so we're moving from the center of the city further down, up the hill towards a new point of gravitation. And so Las Condes over the last 15 years has become a new point of a new space for economic development, for services, for finances. And this is where it started in Apumanque in terms of a space of consumption, 1981. And it was a new type of mall. It was a US type of mall with 250, 350 small stores when it started, and it replaced a different type of space of consumption. Whereas most people traditionally had bought in fairs and other on the streets and in small local shops, basically Apumanque in 1981 offered the opportunity to buy everything in one space undercover, and it replaced what were called the caracoles. The caracoles, the 10 years previously from the early 70s, had been a very special type of design that was very specific to Chilean retail. Basically, the caracol is a space where you walk up inside the building and all the shops are around the edge of that. Something you don't see in the UK or in the rest of Europe, very specific. But unfortunately, after 10 years, this was replaced by Apumanque. And there's still one of those caracoles, one of these snails, just a bit further down. So as the snail was replaced by this new type of US mall, we also have a replacement of a certain type of culture of retail and very much adopting a US style of consumption patterns, which is what we see today, absorbing styles of consumption from Western Europe and the United States and becoming a very homogenized sort of global culture of consumption. And if you like, Apumanque, this one of the earliest malls in Chile, exemplifies that particular starting point in 1981 in dictatorship. Here we are in front of a lighthouse. What's a lighthouse doing in the middle of a city far from the coast? And I'd like to use it as a reference point to talk about different styles of architecture and also to address the issue of what does Latin American culture mean when we see it in urban design and in terms of what they call urban imaginaries are about Latin America and Latin Americanism. And I think the lighthouse is interesting because it's a symbol of something. It's a symbol of bringing people to a place of signification. But the idea here is it's a lighthouse, but with a lot of use of Spanish tiles. And I think the point here is there's a really strong reference to colonial styles of architecture, which may have been reasonable about 30 or 40 years ago when throughout this area, which was solely residential and middle to higher income groups, it certainly had a reference where you would have found a lot of houses with the same types of tiled roofs. And now it seems like a relic in this very modern and postmodern world of concrete and glass. So in this sense, it's no different from other challenges in terms of heritage, in terms of which buildings do you retain, which do you lose. And I think Chile and city centers in Chile in particular, you often don't see that many relics of the past because of earthquake damage and because of the real speed of urban development and urban, what David Harvey would call destructive creation. This desire to basically destroy and then reconstruct, which leads to words that we may well know in urban development, which is geriatrification. And here, although it was an area of middle to higher income residents, now we can see it's become a new central business district. And I think what we see around this area, we start with this old reference to colonial past. We then have very modernist styles, very flat or square, blockish type of buildings. But now in the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen these new high-rise office blocks with very postmodernistic styles. So these aren't just blocks. There's a lot of expense and a lot of architectural design has got into creating very interesting and quite remarkable styles of building. And what does this represent? Are they useful in terms of reducing inequality, of offering particular spaces? Well, not really. It's a manifestation of a type of imaginary or urban imaginary of what's possible and what's desirable. So it's becoming, in a sense, an area where there's experimentation with architecture, but in a sense where we're getting this postmodern landscape or cityscape of past and modern and future. But in a sense, what I'd say is, well, what does this mean about Latin American culture or Latin American urban culture? And it's about that being very highly postmodern, whereby there's a lot of mixing of styles, where people will dress and listen to music from all over the place. So in that sense, in this area, we're not seeing very much that we find dissimilar from certain consumption styles in Western Europe or in Norwich. And I think this is a marked contrast from some of the lower income areas of the city, where, for example, there are certain musical styles, modern and current, that won't be listened to as much here, for example. So I think there's an interesting contrast in terms of areas of the city, the quality of urban design, the type of architecture that's on offer, and the types of cultural consumption in terms of music, clothing, and in terms of what people are buying, and also how they demonstrate that, what we call conspicuous consumption. So I think the reference here will be to what we'll call the Los Angeles School of Geography, where they talked about Los Angeles, how it combined different styles and created this new urban landscape. And in a sense, their idea of postmodern geography, how that contrasted with David Harvey's idea of neo-Marxist geography, because a neo-Marxist interpretation of this landscape is it's a demonstration of wealth. This area is called the cone of wealth, and you have to show that. It's conspicuous. And I think the reference here is to how that really incited or ignited the social uprising in October 2019, because it marks the contrast, it marks the difference, and it marks the segregation and differentiation socioeconomically and also stylistically within Chilean culture. I'd mentioned that this is the municipality of Las Condes, and behind me you can see what's now known as New Las Condes, Nueva Las Condes. Yes, and this area is interesting for 2 or 3 reasons. The first is about globalization and what this type of cityscape represents. The second is in terms of urban planning and what New Las Condes meant in terms of probably one of the biggest urban redevelopment or regeneration projects that started about 15 or 16 years ago. And the third is about really quality of life in Nueva Las Condes, the balance between residential life, work life, which is mainly the service sector here, and what this means in terms of public space and retail and services. So the first issue is about globalization, and I think this particular cityscape of glass-clad skyscrapers is something that we can see everywhere around the world. And I would say that this is what we would define as an urban imaginary of modernity and post-modernity in terms of how these structures have now been developed with different forms, sort of these additional touches. But these are all office blocks. And if you like, something that's interesting in terms of globalization is that there is a local urban norm or standard, so they all have to be the same height. So unlike other cityscapes where you might find taller skyscrapers, smaller ones, in a sense they're all built around the same time over 10 years, and they've all been leveled off, if you like. So it shows that there has been planning behind here. There are certain limitations, but this is the edge of Nueva Las Condes. Behind it, over the last 15 years, we've had incredible investment in office space and new residential departments, most of which will be costing over £400,000 an apartment in this area. So in terms of UK, that's a lot of money, but in terms of Latin America and Chile, that's a tremendous amount of money. So this is really a very isolated pocket of wealth within Las Condes, and then within Santiago, and then wider Chile. So here we have a concentration of wealth, we have a concentration of very postmodern lifestyles, and I think what it shows is how cities, even in Latin America, are moving into the service sector and financial sector. This, if you like, this area is the third evolution of an urban center in Santiago. The first was the old traditional Plaza de Armas, the center that was founded, a foundational center that dates back to the 1500s. And then we have a new area that started being developed in the 1980s called Santiago Sanhattan, which was halfway between the original city center and here, and now have this new pole that's been developed over the last 10 years. So what are the characteristics of this big area called Nueva Las Condes? One, I think it represents global types of preferences for what a modern sustainable city should look like. If anything, it reminds me of La Défense in Paris, which was developed 30 years before, in the sense that this is, if you like, the urban imaginary, the type of public face that Santiago would like to show in terms of being highly modern with very large international firms, or one of these buildings is LAN, which is the, if you like, the national airline company. But what's been interesting is how this has clustered a lot of the global companies. Santiago, for a while, wanted to position itself within the region as sort of the gateway to the region in terms of business. There's literature called World Cities Literature, Peter Taylor and John Beaverstock, Saskia Sassin, who talk about the idea of alpha and beta and gamma world cities. And for a while, this was the idea of how to project Santiago into that particular imaginary of being this enter point for business, effectively, in Latin America. So this was the idea of Santiago being part of the globalization process and showing a very modern and perhaps postmodern idea of what it had to offer to firms. But also said something about the idea of a service economy in Santiago in Chile. And I think in terms of globalization, that hides a brutal reality here, is that basically all of this area is funded by copper revenues, apart from the businesses that have moved in. Chilean economy is still dependent. Over 40% of its PIB, GDP, is based on copper. So when you look at public spending, when you look at the success of certain businesses that are all effectively multiplier sectors linked to copper, many of them service sectors in consultancy and accounting and whatever, even airlines, the role of copper is tremendously important, and that hasn't changed since the beginning of the 1920s, effectively when copper replaced nitrates as its main export product. So in a sense, you could say that this represents the success of the copper industry, because copper had a boom in the 1990s. It really started to spike, and this led to a lot of generation of income, a lot of interest, a lot of dynamism, but highly concentrated. So if you like, this is the manifestation of that concentration of wealth and income in a few people and a few businesses, and investment in property, which is called, if you call it, the second cycle of accumulation. You accumulate through commodities, or other manufacturers, then you invest in urban property. So there's tremendous speculation here, as we see in London with capital from the Middle East, from Russia, and in a sense it's created what's been called a bubble, a property bubble. So the question is whether that can be sustained, these prices can be sustained. But if you like, all Nueva Las Condes, the concept, the design, is built on the booming copper. And so the link between commodities and concentration of wealth in the property sector is really important. The second issue is about urban design. Originally, the idea that they were going to do something really original and different and integrated here. Integration means mix of housing, mix of services, types of residential areas, types of work areas, employment areas. And what they did, they developed a master plan. This was offered to a consultancy called Urbe, but within a year or two, it was clear that nobody really wanted a master plan and an idea of a new area of the city, and basically they left it to the market. So what you have here is a sequence of blocks, either residential or office, but there's no real, there is some public space, there's a bit of design in the pockets in between, but there's no logic of a city here or creating a city. There's, in terms of schools, in terms of clinics and health, in a sense it's typical of modernity in the sense that it's showing the wealth, and it's fragmented. There's no real idea of a high quality city here. It's very much concrete, it's very much a workspace, and people being able to live close, but only if you're very much in probably the top 2 or 3% of incomes in Chile. So in a sense, it's an elite space that very much reflects Chilean society and the concentration of wealth. And so New Las Condes, if you like, is emblematic of that concentration of wealth and how that particular type of elite wants to show itself as being modern and European and decked out in glass as a symbol of this sort of idea of not being in the past in Latin America, being part of the future. And this generates an increasing differentiation with other social groups in Chile. And this lies at the heart of also this idea of the social explosion in October 1919. These little reductions of wealth and elitism compared to how the majority of people live and work and have to move around the cities and in rural areas in the whole of the country. Behind me, with these two signs that I think are quite emblematic, one says, "In danger of collapse," the other says, "The municipality says we're working for you," is what's left of a series of residential blocks built in the early 1970s. This was called the Villa San Luis, and this whole area, including Nueva Las Condes now, and all this area was a farm. And you've got to imagine the speed of expansion of cities in Latin America in post-1950s. tremendous rates of urbanization, tremendous rates of expansion, and so within a decade you see a complete transformation of an area that was residential, low density to high density, or in this case over a few decades a farm being converted into what's now quite a neuralgic spot within the city. But to go back to this, what remains of 1,000 flats within these blocks of 4 floors. And if you like, the story goes back to the 1960s. You've got to think in the 1960s what was happening in Latin America. The president of Chile in the 1960s, a Christian Democrat called Eduardo Frei Montalva, was very much into social change, if you like. There was agrarian reform and also the big issue about housing in these urban centers to respond to the rates of urbanization. At the same time, you had Kennedy in the United States. One of the biggest infrastructure routes near here is called Avenida Kennedy, which reflects his role in financing infrastructure. This was called the Alliance for Progress. And why was Kennedy and Frei, why were they working together? Well, because they were trying to create an opposition to what was happening in Cuba and the export of the revolution into Bolivia, initially in '67, and then the idea was to expand throughout Latin America. So it was also the idea of, well, let's stick with democracy, capitalism, but no communism, thanks very much. So part of the efforts of the Christian Democrats were to create new social housing projects. And this was the biggest of its time. 1,000 families being brought into this area rather than being pushed out of the area onto the urban periphery. So the idea was to work with people where they were living or near where they were living, rather than just pushing them out into informal settlements on the outskirts of the city. The people who came here, a lot of them were living on the banks of the river near here, which goes from the mountains down to the sea, the river Mapocho, and they lived in informal settlements. So for them, this was the big opportunity. This was the part of the, if you like, the big social transformation of the 1960s, with public investment and a very strong focus on social justice here, but not socialism or communism. It's a different view. So it was a huge social housing project, and the idea was to create housing and to enable people to live where they might be working as well, in retail, you've got to think that employment for women in Chile for most of the last century, and still is very important, is domestic service. So working in housing, almost all of the people around this area, middle to high income people, will have somebody who either lives in the house permanently or will come on a day-to-day basis. So this is a tremendous source of employment for women. And about a few years ago, then they changed the legislation about employment, so they have to be contracted. Before it was highly informal and with tremendous exploitation of women's labour within this type of domestic work. So behind me is what's left of 2 blocks. 1970s, the consolidation of this area, and what's interesting, what happens in the 1970s. So as soon as it's becoming consolidated, we have the golpe de Estado, we have the coup, Pinochet takes power, and during the 1970s there's an argument from the military saying, well, this actual project was never really accepted by the municipality in terms of it was never signed off. So although these people who had come actually had the rights to the housing, they were homeowners, this was put in question. So during the 1970s and 1980s, in a sense, there was, if you like, a connection between the military and the elite, saying, do we really need low-income people living in this high-income area? And that generated pace over time. And once we got into the 1990s, the return to democracy in 1990, there was already maneuvers by the property elite to say, well, let's recycle this land. And in a sense, it was about expulsion of these people once again to different areas of the city. So, but this happened much later. This happened also going back 10 or 15 years when, because of the increase in property values in this area, suggested that, well, why have these low-income people, lower-income, middle-income people here? Let's throw them out. And this idea of creative destruction. So the idea, how do you create value in the city? How does capitalism work in the city? You need to keep building and rebuilding, and you push people out. So that any notion of social integration in the 1970s was thrown out. So you have higher concentrations of single income groups around the city because people have been forcibly evicted to other parts of the city. The people who are living here went to a range of different municipalities on the urban periphery, to Pudahuel, for example, in the west, to Puente Alto in the south, and without any care. In fact, when they were actually thrown out in the 80s, there was a particular event when people were basically herded onto buses and taken out and basically thrown off the buses, which you can do under dictatorship, this created this space. So I think it shows this ongoing conflict in Chile between social values, social justice, social housing, and the idea of the city being a commodity for trading to generate more surplus value. And in this area, this is what we've seen. This big event in the 1970s, the transformation of San Luis and social housing, then expulsion, and then the idea of the creation of new Las Condes, which also led to evictions, people living in different parts of this area. So the idea of urban recycling. And the question is this good? Who's it good for? And I think what it shows is this ongoing accumulation of capital based on this second circuit of capital, which is, rather than commodities being the first circuit, it's about property and capital from housing and urban land values, and how you capture those values. Here we are in a lovely green public space. This is called Parque Araucano, which is important, the word Araucano. We came from a place called La Apumanque. Each of these words is a word in Mapudungun, which is the indigenous language of the Mapuche, who lived further down south, but also lived in this region when the Spanish arrived in the conquest 500 years ago. So it's interesting how these very modern landscapes employ what they're called toponymy of the indigenous language. So what's important about this park? I think one of the big issues in Santiago, but other cities as well, is the issue of public space and green public space. This park looks very similar to parks in the UK, parks in France, Germany, whatever, in terms of how they laid out the design. The French influence in park design in Chile has been very important. And in a sense, although this was built relatively recently, those same types of logics of park design were established. But the point here is not about this particular design, but it's about this as a public space. This is a very large, green lung within Las Condes. And the question here is, well, who's it for? Who pays to maintain it? And this is where we get into very interesting issues about urban politics and control. Parks like these are run by municipalities, these public spaces, and Las Condes has a very large number of public spaces. So what we have is an issue within comparing 34 municipalities within the city. The World Health Organization defines 9 square meters a person as being a reasonable coverage, and almost all of the municipalities in Santiago fall beneath that number. So here we have a very large green space, and before a lot of the high-rise offices were built, there was a relatively large population living right beside it. So the question now is, well, who's this green space for? On one side of this park, we have a very large commercial mall, the biggest in Santiago, the biggest in Chile, one of the biggest in Latin America. And on the other side, we have mainly office blocks, and behind there, some new residential areas. So the question is, why do we preserve these urban spaces, these green spaces? What is the responsibility of the municipality? And here we get into the issue of urban politics, and particularly something very Latin American, is the power of local mayors and mayoresses. So this is the issue I want to engage with at the moment. It's about local power relations and how this links up with capitalism and surplus value. In terms of urban politics, what we have in the middle of this park that was built about 5-7 years ago is something called Vida Parque, which is park life, which is somehow odd when you think that this new built space within the park replaces the idea of exercise and the park as an area of relaxation, of activity. And what we have in this new space that was built is a kids area called Kidzania, which is an international chain of children's games. We have a gym, we have restaurants. It's very similar to what you'd find in a typical large-scale mall, but in this sense outside, but in a public park with this types of design like the dome. And there are actually 3 floors of parking underneath here as well. And the question here is about public space and private space and financing and investment. So what's interesting about this particular space is that why did the municipality who own this park, why did they decide to create this space, approve this space, and also what are the motivations for this? So here we get into urban politics and the role of mayors and the idea of local autonomy. Municipalities in Chile are autonomous entities. In that sense, they're sort of they're not linked to presidential and congressional politics. Very important is local voting for your local mayor, mayoress, and they have a large budget and can do, they have quite a degree of autonomy. And in particular, this municipality, which is one of the 2 richest municipalities in Chile of 350. And what was controversial about this space, talking about the lack of green space generally within the city, is that it was very controversial. Initially, the idea was to create an aquatic park, to have the original park and create an aquatic park because there was a public swimming pool here, previously owned by the University of Chile. And the idea was how to take this swimming pool, expand it, and create a park, but with this water feature, bearing in mind that the temperatures in the summer go way beyond 30 degrees. So creating this attraction. And now when you look at this space, since it's been approved, since it's been concessioned, is there are no water features. The original swimming pool has disappeared. There is no aquatic park, which was the original design and the original commitment, creating a park for people to use in the local community. And what we have is an emphasis on converting public space into a public concession effectively. And why would they do that? Well, because this concession generates tremendous income for the municipality. So in a sense, this gives the alcalde and his followers considerable power to do more other types of activities, but also politically it consolidates the existing mayor, which have been from the same party, the right-wing party, for since the return to democracy in 1990. So the issue here is, what do we understand by public space? What do we understand by capitalism and creative destruction, and the importance or the opportunities for local governments to actually generate their own income? So this infrastructure is one of the most important contributions to the income of the municipality, amongst car licenses, amongst other commercial licenses. But this is a concession of land that they pay every year. So the question is, where does this stop? What are the limits of action for local mayors in terms of the ability to generate income? And why is there that need to generate income? It can be used on education, municipal education, it can be used on municipal health. But that's where it gets interesting in the sense we have these 350 microcosms of power in Chile that are very important. And people relate to those microcosms of power, also to the presidency, the idea of its patrimonial politics or patriarchal politics. And then we have Congress of elected officials, deputies and senators and the like. But it's really at the local level that we get some interesting issues about urban politics and decisions made about building high-rise offices and residential areas, about building this type of modern structure to generate income for local government spending, and how in many ways they needed to change the norms. This was an aquatic park after all, to be able to achieve those goals. Here we are in Parque. Once again, this name, an indigenous name, but representing something completely different. This is a palace of consumption. So this is the last leg of our journey. We started looking at Apumanque, which is this mall built in 1981. And although that investment in this modern, at that time, mall was significant, at the same time, this type of investment was arriving from the United States with a lot of force. So this mall has over 300 stores in it, much bigger than the ones in Apumanque, and it shows this evolution of consumption. This evolution of consumption from the spiral snail type of mall through to Apumanque, a very postmodern mall with a mix of architectural modern style with Tex-Mex type of architecture with Spanish tiling, and we end up with this type of really, really modern, massive mall. And Latin America now is full of these malls. You may have heard in the United States with the pandemia that this type of scale is now in decline. A lot of the big companies in the States who own many, many malls are actually thinking how to reconfigure, redesign them and sell them off, for example, for apartment blocks or for universities. But here we have, even under pandemic, a site that is, I would say, is growing and will continue to grow. It sort of reflects the consumption in Chilean society since the 1980s to date, very much linked with the idea of neoliberalism, and the idea of neoliberalism is about consumption. You may have heard something called the Theory of Modernization. This was defined in the 1960s by Walt Rostow in the United States, and it sort of defined how development should take place, starting out with pre-modern agricultural societies and working through 5 stages, through proto-industrialization, industrialization, drive to maturity, and finally you end up with the age of mass consumption. So the age of mass consumption in terms of its physical form is embodied in this palace of consumption. I've lived in Chile now for 16 years, and I've come to Chile since 1991 when I started my PhD here. And over those 30 years, I've seen Parque grow. It grows organically, incrementally. You can see the construction here. That used to be a parking lot. On the other side, this was 1 story. And so it adds and adds and adds. It grows organically because of the demand for consumption, how consumption también also represents lifestyles in Chile. A very famous Chilean anthropologist called Thomas Mullian wrote a book 20 years ago about consumption. There was another pamphlet before that, and it was called Consumo me consume, consumption consumes me. And he defined the Chilean model of capitalism, late capitalism, through consumption. And this was a rejection of the Allende model of the road to socialism, of collective consciousness, of social housing, of socialized benefits and health and education. This is the idea of the individual consuming. And what you have in Chile is this graduation and a growing differentiation between those who can consume luxury products, for example, and those who consume generally in public fairs and informal activities in the street. They're buying and selling in those spaces. So what we've seen in the last 5 years in particular here is an increase in luxury goods, in really high-end consumption. And we have this a design space and also a really luxury brand space. So in a sense, it's catering to an elite. And Las Condes has that elite. It's part of that, of the composition or the demographic in this particular municipality. So what I would conclude on is saying it defines Latin America, the idea of differentiation in terms of socioeconomic class, in terms of income, and in terms of culture and how people spend their money, and the importance of appearance in that. So it's that differentiation, I think, that's very particular to Latin America compared with perhaps Asia, Africa, also including Western Europe, but more similar to the United States in terms of this idea that you have to show your wealth. And this is very important. This is where people buy that lifestyle, that they can show their wealth and show how they consume as part of this idea of being able to get on. So it's really embedded in a post-war ideology of development, which is the age of mass consumption. So here we are. This is, if you like, the apex of the neoliberal model. It was predicated on a neoliberal revolution, replacing Allende's road to socialism. the idea that people will be free to generate income, deregulated, minimized role of the state, working through markets. And I think it's interesting to be here in this palace of consumption, because one asks, well, what is this the goal? Thinking of Rostow's modernization theory, the age of mass consumption. What becomes beyond the age of mass consumption? Because here in Chile we do have consumption, but I wouldn't say it's mass consumption. What we have is a highly elite consumption of luxury goods, of international brands, and of a certain lifestyle that is very similar to lifestyles in North America, or elite lifestyles in North America and Western Europe. That seems to be the aspiration. But the problem is in Chile that this is available and accessible to a very small percentage of the population who don't have the income to consume in places like this, and also because of racism and ethnicity and class issues, they will be frowned upon also being around here. However, at the same time, who works here? Thousands of people who have to come here from other municipalities every day, long journeys of at least an hour each way. And something just to close is to say, well, to what extent is this an elite space of consumption? When 3 or 4 years ago, the suggestion was to build a metro station right next to this complex, actually in the park, this was rejected by the local community and by the municipality because, to quote the leader of the local neighborhood association, they thought it would bring delinquents into the area. So you can't access this place easily by public transport. So it's, in a sense, it represents segregation in Chile, segregation in terms of where people live, where they work, what they consume. And for me, it defines the neoliberal model of exclusion, segregation, and elitism. So this is the end of our brief trip through a wealthy neighborhood in Santiago de Chile. And you see these types of neighborhoods throughout Latin America. However, I often think in development, we end up focusing on poverty without looking at inequality from both sides. We have to look at high income and consumption to actually understand the issues of inequality, not just looking at the outcomes of low inequality, of poor access, but also how do the rich live and how do the rich perceive the poor in this discussion. And I think when we look at consumption, look at lifestyles, we look at ways in which also people are excluded from green spaces, or really the way in which capitalism works and accumulation works as well, and the concentration of that within a small percentage of society. This is when we start to see Latin America, the real challenges of Latin America coming to the fore. So that's what I'll leave you with. You know, consumption is a critical part of Latin American inequality, and I think that we should really reflect on these things, and I hope you had enjoyed this afternoon's discussion and our short trip through this neighborhood.